what was the worst year in history? And of the 10 responses, one was 1914. Until the end of July 1914, Europe was rich, prosperous, and peaceful. By that December, hundreds of thousands of men lay dead across the continent. And although the world did not know it, Europe faced another 4 years of a conflict that would cast a long and poisonous shadow over the future. That was her vote. John Barry, author. The year 1918, he thought was the worst. The year saw not only the butchery of World War I, but a worldwide influenza pandemic. You're probably aware of that. He's written a book called The Great Influenza. Estimates of the death toll range from nearly 2% to well over 5% of the entire world population. It's possible that influenza killed more people in September, October, and November of 1918 than AIDS has killed in all the years since it entered the human population. And the next guess was 1919. This is a professor of physics at Harvard. Despite being the year after the war ended, 1919 planted the seeds for World War II, as well as for many of the Middle East problems we face today. Plus, between 1918 and 1920, influenza killed a significant fraction of the world's population. So we are examining 3 of the worst years in all of human history. But 1919, in many ways, is the first year of the 20th century. It opens the century. So that's why I'm concentrating on it. It was the year that the war had ended 6 weeks earlier, in November of 1918, as you know. But 1919 was the year when they gathered the leading lights of the nations gathered in Versailles to write the treaties. There were actually 4 treaties. There were separate treaties with Germany, with Austria, with Hungary, with Bulgaria, and Turkey. And the peacemaking actually lasted from June 28th of 1919, when they signed the Treaty of Versailles, to 1921 or 22, when the final settlement with Turkey was made. Because what you see is the collapse of 4 multinational empires: the Ottoman, the Habsburg, the Hohenzollern, and the Romanov. 4 major empires all collapse by 1917, 1918. Well, you can imagine what the problems of establishing the world is. And so it all comes together, of course, as the war ends. Now let me go back just a little bit. I talked about the coming of the war, the cost of the war, the fact that mobilization put millions under arms, that the whole concept of war had changed once industrialization became widespread. And so what looked to be a quick war, because that was the nature of wars in the 19th century, there were no extended wars. This was different. The German attempt to move quickly into France and knock out the French in August of 1914 has failed. And thereafter, what you had was a slow war of attrition, which no one had expected. 1917, maybe the worst year of the war. 16 and 17, the most terrible battles of the war. The battle, for example, of the Somme, the worst day in the history of the British Army. The British lost, between 9 a.m. and noon, 20,000 men. 20,000 deaths in 3 hours. It's interesting that when in 2016, when they were memorializing the war, the royal family came to the battlefield at the Somme, because this was the most terrible and expensive day in the whole history of British Army. How do you feel after that's over? What's the psychological damage of a battle like that? And simultaneously, in order to relieve the British, the Battle of Verdun began. There was no specific reason for the Germans to attack Verdun. One sec. But as the German general explaining the reason for the battle said, I think I have it here, if we, to achieve, what he thought was if they could get France out of the war, England would be forced out too. Within our reach, behind the French sector of the Western Front, there are objectives for the retention of which the French General Staff would be compelled to throw in every man they have. If they do so, the forces of France will bleed to death, as there can be no question of a voluntary withdrawal, whether we reach our goal or not. In other words, the main purpose of the Battle of Verdun was to bleed the French army to the death. No general who had ever plotted war had ever assumed that a battle was worth that kind of cost. You went to war not for a strategic objective, but because you knew the French would not withdraw and we will bleed them to death. 350,000 dead on both sides. 350,000 Frenchmen, 350. This was a war like no other that had ever been fought. As I think it was who H.G. Wells said, this is a war that has a middle, and then another middle, and another middle, and another middle. That was 1917. One after, no end in sight. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson, who had just been re-elected president by a very slim margin, I might say, Woodrow Wilson made a call to all the belligerents to cease. Just stop where it is, make peace with no annexations and no contingencies. Just simply stop, go back to where you were. Well, the British and the French gave him a muted answer. But the Germans insisted, no, we have a price for peace. We want a little bit of Belgium and a little bit of northern. They enunciated what their war aims were. They wanted territory. They wanted to continue their progress toward a kind of, I guess, majority status within Europe. They had made gains in the war. They insisted on retaining those gains. In other words, they turned it down. They wanted to continue with the war. They were winning, so they assumed that this was not the right time to start. This is what they told Wilson. They liked Belgium, northern France, parts of Poland, the Baltic, the Ukraine, and a Central European customs union. That was the course for the decision. They wanted a solid base for German domination of Europe and an enormous market for their industrial goods. That's what their aims were in the war. So they came closest in 1917. In 1917, mutinies began. The French, for example, army, there were mutinies in the army. There were mutinies among, within the Italian ranks. Italy had joined the war in 1915. Italy was actually an ally of Germany's, but since it was not a defensive war, they didn't have to come into the war. And so they kind of jockeyed around for who will give me the most. And since the British and the French could promise them part of Austrian territory, they acceded to the British and French side. The Italians paid a fearful price for this. The Battle of Caporetto. Is any of you familiar with Caporetto? The most terrible battle in all of Italian history. The lines kept breaking. The Austrians kept moving forward and the Italians kept retreating. How do you finish a retreat? The officers ordered that every 10th man in the line be shot. That will stabilize the line. That was Caporetto. So, every 10th man was shot by his own officer. That will keep them fighting. How do you recover? Can you understand the recovery from a battle like this? Well, 1917 may be the worst year of the war. It looked as though it was never going to come to the end. Woodrow Wilson in 1916, after he failed to get any response to his plea for peace, put forth a document that he thought could perhaps prove a kind of pattern for the new world that would come once this war was over. It was, he called it the 14 points. Very, very famous. This was his blueprint for the New World Order, once these idiots laid down their arms. And I might mention, this was a worldwide war. Did you know that Japan fought in the war on the side of England? That China was a belligerent. China came into the war in 1917, assuming it was better to be on the same side as the Japanese. So they entered the war. In 1917, it was 1916, the 14. This was the blueprint for the New World Order. And it was the abolition of secret diplomacy, freedom of the seas, reduction of arms. I won't go through the whole thing, but a return of Belgium, because the Germans had occupied Belgium since day one, a restoration of French territory, various readjustments, colonial claims to be adjusted so that the colonized world would have more of a role in their own lives. The Russians who would be welcomed and so on. But the major point was, after the war is over, there will be something called an international organization, and that will settle disputes. So never again can you come into something like this horrendous war. Well, the League of Nations had actually been proposed a year earlier, 1915, a meeting of various American dignitaries in Philadelphia, led by a former president, William Howard Taft. And they had proposed something along these lines. There had been movements in Europe toward arbitration of disputes, the Hague Tribunal, for example. But this would be something it would be called the League of Nations. And that was an important part of the 14 points. And when the war ended, he said, peace can be made on the basis of this program. Well, nobody paid too much attention to it, but it was translated into various languages, and it became a fulcrum of hope for many people. It was even translated into Chinese. The war ended, as you know, in 1918. The Germans in early 1918 were at the height of their power. The Russians had sued for peace after the revolution. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk had been signed. And if you want to know what a treaty dictated by the Germans would look like, you just have to read this treaty. All of European Russia was annexed by the Germans. All of the output, the minerals and wheat and so on, would be annexed by the Germans. It was a terrible peace. As Lenin said, it is a terrible peace, but we must have peace. So they signed it, knowing that without peace, the revolution would be struck away. So apparently, that was the great March 1918, at the height of their power. Now they will begin the final assault on France. The United States came into the war in 1917. Why? Because the Germans were suffering from the British blockade. In those days, a blockade was respected. Neutral vessels were respected. So, unable to trade with Germany during the war, all our trade was with England. We were supplying England with food, with ammunition. The Germans, because of the blockade, were facing massive food shortages. The only thing to do was to break the blockade. And you could only do that by enunciating sub-warfare. Up to this point, they had observed the rules of neutrality. Neutral vessels must be permitted free passage. Now and they knew it would probably bring the United States into the war. But nevertheless, they were facing a massive food shortage, and so in early 1917, they announced the end of they would no longer respect neutral vessels. Any neutral ship would be a fair target for the submarines. That apparently was the last straw for Wilson. First, on a practical level, we were involved with the British. It was in our interest that the British not lose the war, because they owed us massive debts. Secondly, we were naturally allied with the British from the point of view of heritage and philosophy and so on. But Wilson now faced a dilemma. What happens when they start sinking American ships, which began in early 1917? And just simply out of principle, but also out of economic necessity, Wilson finally in April had to ask the Congress for a declaration of war against Germany on the basis that Germany was violating international law. The United States Army in 1917 was 17th in the world as far as numbers were concerned. The Germans thought they weren't risking much. The United States was a minor distraction. Oh, maybe they had a little success pursuing Pancho Villa in Mexico, but they would apply the knockout blow before the United States had time to rally its forces and draft an army and so on and move them to Europe. Well, as it happened, economically, by 1916, although no one knew it, the United States was the strongest power in the world economically. If you look at the economic statistics, no one understood that. But the United States, economically, had become the #1 power in the world. And for a #1 power to raise an army and equip an army within a short time, by for example, late 1917, the first troops began to arrive and the first weapons began to arrive. For the weary French, for the British, this came at the most important time. The Germans decided the Russians were out. They had beaten them badly. They were now in control of all of European Russia. Now, one final campaign to knock the French out. The French were tottering anyhow. They would amass a major campaign from Belgium south to knock out the French and then dictate peace. Ludendorff was in charge. It was called Operation Michael, and we will do it before the American troops begin to arrive. So in March 1918, Germany, which had won most of the battles up to that point, they now launch Operation Michael, just as American troops are beginning to arrive in numbers. And Ludendorff is the architect of Michael. It goes very well at the beginning, but American troops in their first engagement didn't impress. But that was the first engagement. Now the troops and the weapons and the food begins to arrive, and the German troops now encounter defeats as Operation Michael falters in the summer of 1918. It's interesting too, I don't know if I mentioned last time, the flu, the worst epidemic, I guess, since the Black Death, had broken out there have been numerous books on it. They seem to believe it originated, the epidemic originated in an army camp in Kansas. That's where the flu bug apparently first struck. And when American soldiers went over to France, they apparently carried the germ. They themselves were struck by flu in late 17, early 18, as were the British. But it was a mild form of the flu. What happened, though, was that the bug mutated. It mutated into a virulent form of flu that was especially dangerous for young people. And so this began, it was kind of hidden, but the Americans and the British survived the first phase of the flu. But in late 1918, the second virulent flu began to appear, and it attacked the German army. The German army they kept it very quiet, but they were beginning to suffer the effects of the flu. It would eventually go around the world, as you know, and kill 5% of the world's population. 5%. 10 million in India alone. The United States, Philadelphia was an epicenter, apparently. But, so the flu, combined with the arrival of American troops and goods, finally persuaded Ludendorff to go to the Kaiser and announce that they couldn't go on with the war. How could that be? Imagine the reaction in Germany. We just, destroyed the Russians. We own the Ukraine. We picked up all this. We've won every battle. How could this be? Suddenly, out of the blue, Ludendorff comes home and says to the Kaiser, it's lost. The war is lost. What a shock. How could we have lost? We were winning all along. Well, the Germans are astounded. Not the army, of course, they understood what was happening. The army leaders, Hindenburg, Ludendorff, understood. Weren't you just planning a campaign in Central Asia? That was true. Ludendorff was planning a campaign after he finished off the French. They were going to send an army to Mesopotamia and then into Afghanistan. They had high plans. Now it was all over. And the Germans have to ask for an armistice. Now, what is interesting is in last weeks of October, early November, what happens is that the German army, for the first time, revolts begin. Sailors mutiny at the port of Kiel. Disorder in the streets. All of those people who had questioned the war, socialists, various groups that had really not been wedded to militarism, they all begin to demonstrate in the streets. What you have is a kind of, chaos in the streets. And then amidst this chaos, they go to the Kaiser and they say to him, it would be better if you abdicated. We'll get better terms, because the Kaiser had become, the source of hatred and so on. We'll get better. Why should I abdicate? He said. He didn't want to do it. However, this is what he said. This is November 1918. I wouldn't dream of abandoning the throne because of a few hundred Jews and 1,000 workers. See, already this had begun. And the whole history of anti-Semitism is very interesting to explore, but even in I think in 1917, the army had begun a survey to see what the Jewish participation rate was in battles, whether they were shirking their duties or not. You can see already the effect of late 19th century anti-Semitism in Germany. Why should the Kaiser do that? He wouldn't dream of it. However, they assumed that terms would be easier if he were out and you had a republic. And the leaders of the parties in the Reichstag, these were the ones, the Social Democrats, the Workers' Party, the Catholic Party. They had nothing to do with the war. They didn't want the war. They were anti-military, but they were the ones who had to pick up the pieces. And so there were demonstrations in the streets, crowds protesting, and the leaders of the two main parties in the Reichstag came out on the balcony to address a crowd, and one said to the crowd, "I now proclaim the German Republic." The other said, "Why did you do that?" "I didn't know what else to say." The German Republic. November the 7th, the Kaiser went to Holland. He lived out, I think he died in 42 or 43, something like that. Lived a long time. He had a relative, he was related to the Dutch royal family, so they gave him an estate in which to live out the rest of his years. He was gone. Germany was now, what, a republic? Never been a republic, but we're going to be a republic. That'll get us better terms. And the army now contacts the American army, tells them that they are ready to sign an armistice. They will sign an armistice on the basis of the 14 points. They make that essential. On the basis of Wilson's 14 points, we will surrender. The famous surrender occurs in November of 1918. Amid these wild scenes at home, riots. There was a problem with communists in Germany. They were setting up communes. There was one set up in Bavaria, and fear that Bolshevism was going to take over. Anyhow, that's what they would do. Later, they claimed the Treaty of Versailles was invalid because they had given up on the basis of the 14 points. The point is this: they had to give up regardless. It's not for the people that are losing to make stipulations and say we'll only do it. They later claimed it was invalid. We surrendered on the basis of Wilson's 14 points. And nevertheless, the armistice was proclaimed. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th year, the guns for the first time would fall silent after years and years of carnage. The worst war in the history of the world. There's no question. The suffering. Wilson announces the armistice. What he says is, "A supreme moment of history has come. The hand of God is laid upon the nations. He will show them favor only if they rise to the clear heights of his own justice and mercy." And the agreement, what bursts forth, as the New York Times says, a delirious carnival of joy beyond comparison with anything ever seen in the history of New York. America was clearly the top nation, and history came to us. It was because of this tremendous prestige enjoyed by America that Wilson's 14 points formed the basis for the reorganization of the world. Well, they were going to reorganize the world, but it was a world full of corpses. The Germans had lost 1 million dead. The French, 1,700,000. Austria-Hungary, 1,500,000. Italy, 460,000. Russia, 1,700,000. Turkey, 800,000. The U.S., 140,000. The light totals. Between 1870 and 1899, there were 16 million male births in Europe. 13% of them died. Between 1892 and 1895, 3 years, Britain and France, of the total male births in both countries, 37% died. Of the wounded, 15 million and one-half named for life. So there was it was an armistice, but how could you rejoice, as George Bernard Shaw said, when when all the good men have been blown to bits? So there was how could you rejoice in the midst of this terrible carnage? But nevertheless, it was decided that the peace conference would convene. There would be actually 5 treaties signed. There was one with Germany, that was the main one, the Treaty of Versailles, but there would be separate treaties with Austria, with Bulgaria, with Hungary, with Turkey. The last one wasn't signed until, I think, 1920 or 21. But nevertheless, there would be separate negotiations. But, as you can imagine, the main one was the Treaty of Versailles. That was the treaty with Germany. And that was what they came to Versailles. Woodrow Wilson was the first American president to leave the U.S. during his term of office. But he sailed over. He actually sailed over, came back, and then went back again. And so he was the man at the center. When he came to Europe, he was greeted as a hero beyond the New World Messiah. This is from an Europe Nouvelle newspaper. Wilson, you have given back the father to his home, the plowman to his field. You have saved our fiancés. Love blooms anew. Wilson, you have saved our children. Through you, evil is punished. Wilson, Wilson, glory to you who, like Jesus, have said, peace on earth and goodwill to men. In Italy, the greeting, instead of, ciao or whatever, they say, Woodrow Wilson. They say he thinks of us, the poor people, that he wants us all to have a fair chance, that he is going to do something when he gets here that will make it impossible for our government to send us to war again. If he had only come sooner. I have already lost my 2 sons. Do you believe he is strong enough to stop all wars? Well, these were the expectations. No one had ever had a reception like this as Wilson. He was the savior. And of course, there's nowhere to go from that peak, but nowhere else to go. Well, the Treaty of Versailles was the subject of lengthy negotiation. It was the treaty with Germany, and it was the major treaty. They were assuming it would sort of be like the Congress of Vienna, which ended the Napoleonic Wars. Congress of Vienna was attended by the Tsar of Russia, the Emperor of Austria, the King of Prussia, the French sent their best diplomat. The king, but this was the middle class. Clemenceau had been a newspaper editor. Lloyd George had been a lawyer. Excuse me, it was reversed. Wilson had been a college professor. They all came from middle class backgrounds. You can see how the history had evolved, looking at the different class backgrounds. But everybody was there. This was going to be another round. Everybody was there except the Germans. Because at the Treaty of Paris that ended the Napoleonic Wars, the French had gotten a very good deal. They had known, the arts of diplomacy. They didn't want that to happen again, so the Germans wouldn't come. They would get the terms of the treaty when it was ready to be handed over to them. Well, I guess the best book on the treaty is one that came out a few years ago by Margaret Macmillan called Paris, 1919. It's a very interesting book. Paris, for a few months, became the center of the universe. Sarah Bernhardt performed. Proust was sitting in the cafe. It was the center of the world for a few months, of the artistic world, the intellectual world, and everyone sent delegates. There were Chinese delegates. The Japanese, who are now part of the Big Five, they sent their best diplomats. The Italians, of course the French, the British. Before it even convened, Clemenceau and Lloyd George had kind of made agreements. This is what we'll think about when we get to Paris. But it was, a brilliant affair. Theater every night. Elsa Maxwell was hosting fancy parties. In fact, there's a funny story. Lloyd George's oldest daughter came over for a weekend, and Clemenceau gave her, incidentally, he was shot during the conference by someone on the street. He was not gravely wounded, but he did suffer a shortly had a bad time, but he was not a believer in capital punishment, so he insisted that when they tried the assassin, he wouldn't get more than a 10-year term. Kind of him, but nevertheless, so everybody was there, and they had to work out the treaty, which was not easy to do. So there were a lot of compromises in the treaty. First, they redid the map of Europe. The principle of nationality was everything. Poles should live in a Polish country. Hungarians should live in everybody should live according to the principle of nationality. That was key. But what happens if you have small groups stranded in the wrong country? Well, they found a way to make that right. They insisted on minorities treaties. In other words, each country would sign a treaty saying that they would not mistreat their minorities. That meant a lot, as you can imagine. I think there were 800 cases reported of minority discrimination, and 4 were settled. So this will give you an idea. But they had to make some compromise. Well, in the end, it was a treaty that, it was the best that could be done, I guess. This is the terms. Germany lost a lot of territory. They lost a strip of land between East Prussia and Poland, the Polish corridor, because Poland needed an outlet to the sea. The German coal mining area in the Saar Valley was transferred to France for 15 years. The Rhineland, which right up against was a protection, the French wanted to annex it. That became an international zone. It would be demilitarized as a protection for the French. The Germans had to give up the Navy was reduced to a few small ships. The Army could not exceed 100,000 soldiers. They were not permitted to construct aircraft tanks, cannon, or submarines. And in the end, I guess, I have a map here. You see how much the map changed. But in the end, the Germans, the French, who had suffered the most because their land had been invaded and their cities destroyed, who's going to pay for all this damage? Well, they had a model. In the Franco-Prussian War, the Germans had won, and the French had paid for all the damage. Well, we think the same thing should be done now. The Germans should pay for the damage. Well, Germany was not, everybody was responsible. It wasn't just Germany's responsibility for the war. Everybody should pay. Well, what about pensions? What about reconstruction, reparations? You did the damage, you should pay the bill. Well, more and more, that became the line of the French. And the Germans, who really, in a sense, we're not the same country anymore. We had a Kaiser. Now we're a republic. We have elections. We're a democratic republic. Why should Germany pay the whole bill? Well, because you were most responsible for the war. That became a great, through the years, it's become, wasn't everybody responsible? No, you were responsible. Well, in the end, they decided you had to have some rationale for Germany being forced to pay this huge bill, which incidentally they never paid. Thus was born clause number 231, the War Guilt Clause. Germany is responsible for the cost that will be determined by a commission because they started the war. They were responsible for the war. Why were we responsible? They absolutely no response. Article 231. They threw that in. The French were terrified of the Germans. They came twice. They're going to come again. That was the French feeling. They came in 1870, and then they came again in 1914. France did not invade Germany. It's the reverse. And they saw, Germany had surpassed them in industry, in commerce, in wealth. Germany, the point of it all was that there is always a dominant nation in the world, a number one. And this was Germany's bid for number one status, her place in the sun, they called it. Through the there's England with all her, with her colonies and her India and, the dominions and so on. That's the place that Germany coveted. The whole discussion is fraught still with controversy. The treaty is fraught with controversy to this day. But in the main, I think that most historians would conclude that it was Germany's bid for number one status in the world. They would take the place that the British occupied in the 19th and the French in the 18th. Germany would emerge as the central power of the continent and of the world. They had colonies, but they had come late to the game of, colonial expansion, because they weren't unified till 1871. So this was their bid for world power, Weltpolitik, and they had been desperately, at the last minute, deflected from that ambition by the entry of the United States. Okay.
A quick question. Did any of these rocket scientists who drew up this theory put into the treaty a means of enforcement? Enforcement. So you have a document.
The League of Nations.
Yeah, but the League of Nations had no army. It had no way to mobilize troops. And in fact, we live in the same kind of world. The United Nations has no effective army. The International Court has no mechanism of enforcement. So the question I raise to you is, if you have laws but no means of enforcement, what do the laws mean?
Wilson assumed that role would be played by the League of Nations. They had no means, but the assumption was that this was the starting place, that eventually the League of Nations their decisions would be enforced perhaps by an international army. What he said was, this is the best we could do. Wilson, he focused on that, the League. That was his baby. The others focused on, what can we get out of this? So the Japanese, for example, came to Wilson. They wanted to take over all of the German leaseholds in China. Germany had quite a bit of territory in China. But the Chinese were there. China for the Chinese. They came to Wilson. You said that imperialism was wrong, and that China should retain her own territory. Why give it to the Japanese if we've just evicted the Germans? Well, Wilson appealed to the Japanese. We have to be true to the concept of national self-determination. And the Japanese were very clever. They said, you won't give us Shandong. That was the main German leasehold. No. Think about it. All right. We like a declaration. Now, this may have been, I guess, Machiavellian, or maybe not. We want a declaration in the treaty. All men are created equal. No racial separation. All men are equal. Can you do that for us? Of course he couldn't do that for them. The treaty would never get through the U.S. Senate if he gave them that. So it was either lose the treaty in the Senate, which he did anyhow, or give them Shandong. So he gave them Shandong. The Chinese never signed the treaty. They left. They walked out. The Italians didn't get everything they wanted. They walked out too, but they came back. The Italians wanted parts of territory that was going to go to the new nation of Yugoslavia. That would be an enlarged Serbia. They wanted parts of mixed population. And Wilson told them that it was just impossible. They were people living in that area who were not Italian. It should go to the new nation of Yugoslavia. They needed an outlet to the sea. So the Italians said, very well, we're leaving. They walked out. They came back later. But it's interesting that Yugoslavia did not get Fiume because after the war, an Italian poet with grandiose ambitions named D'Annunzio led an army of volunteers that forcibly took over the city of Fiume and invented a new style which would befit the coming fascist movement in Europe. But that's another story. All right. So they did the best they could. It was a treaty that was made up of compromises. There were parts of the treaty that were extremely popular. New nations were created out of old. The whole map of Europe was redone on the basis that if the Germans moved into the Rhineland, England and the United States would come to their aid. The treaty was torn up because when the treaty was rejected by the Senate, that treaty went down the drain. Okay, yeah. Okay, questions?
Were there any reparations for the United States in that treaty?
They were never paid. The Germans had reparations, due.
To us, to the United States?
They kept deferring it. The Germans really never paid them. And they got around the treaty. They signed an agreement with the Russians soon after at Rapallo. The German army was limited to 100,000. Well, they signed an agreement the German troops would train with Russian troops somewhere in the Russian steppes where no one knew about it. Or German plane, no planes, no warplanes. But every civilian plane had a little drop thing in the bottom so a paratrooper could drop it. They were building it up, but undercover. They called it the Black Reichswehr. That was the German army. They were building it up, but out of sight. They were violating the treaty here and there. But they suffered treatment. They lost all their mandated territory in Africa. They lost all of their territory mandates in Asia. And it's very interesting. The mandates, the Germans had a lot of islands in the Pacific that they had grabbed in the late 19th century. The Bismarck Archipelago, the Carolines, and so on. So it was decided that the north of the equator, Japan would get the islands as mandates. Below the equator, Australia and New Zealand would share the mandates. There was a big argument over that. And at one point, Wilson said to I think it was the Premier of New Zealand, you don't really want to snap up those mandates that used to belong to Germany. That's a sort of imperialism. You don't want to be guilty of that. Do you want to really pick up those mandates in violation of the wishes of their inhabitants? And the Prime Minister of Australia said, that's about the size of it, Mr. President. And that was about the size of it. But even in, there was no sense of joy after this. The French were terrified. They saw that, in a sense, they had not gotten what they wanted. They lost the guarantee from the United States and England. They began now to construct the Maginot Line, which was going to protect them from another German advance. Okay. Oh, right.
Do I understand you to say that if there was no flu pandemic, the Germans...
The flu.
Yeah, if there was no flu, the Germans probably would have won?
I don't know. Probably not. The United States was too powerful in its intervention. But just let me say, just in closing, nobody was dancing in the streets. How could you, after everything that had happened? But after the Keynes book, that was 1919. Another book was published, 1920, by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Repington, called The First World War. Up to that point, it was the Great War, the First World War. And it was a shocking title. What occurred after Versailles was a feeling that it was unfinished, that somehow the Allies had failed. It was, you've heard of war guilt. This was peace guilt. It was somehow they felt guilty for the peace. We know now that Germany, within 20 years, was again the strongest power in the world, or in Europe, excuse me. And we know that it was prophetic. The Economist, the British magazine, the final crime was the Treaty of Versailles, whose harsh terms would ensue a Second World War. That was the Economist. But the other point of view, had the treaty been harsher on Germany, if it had divided the country in two, as happened in 1945, or more, as was the case before 1871, separate entities, there might have been no Via Dolorosa of Rhineland, Anschluss, Sudetenland, Danzig for Europe to walk between 1936 and 39. The peacemakers were willing to wound, but afraid to strike. And in the end, the peace guilt really paralyzed the Europeans. When Hitler took over the Rhineland in 1936, they entered the demilitarized Rhineland. The French troops just moved on out. And the troops that entered the Rhineland had been given the commander a note. If resisted, withdraw at once. No resistance. And in many ways, the war had devastated Europe to such an extent. They simply couldn't conceive of doing it all over again. How could they go through this Gotterdammerung yet again? Anything was better, even making up to Hitler. Even as late as 1940, when England was hung in the balance. When France surrendered in a month, something like that. They couldn't go through they were too civilized to go through what they had gone through in 1914. And even England looking for a way out in 1940, as you probably know. Even that, they could not face it again. They were too civilized to think about going through the whole thing again. But the losers were not. Well, I might mention to you just simply this. I'm sorry to keep you, but at the very end, the feeling was not glee, even though there were a lot of parties at Versailles, so on. But the feeling really was, T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, sums it up better than anything, The Wasteland. How could you celebrate when every young man you knew had been blasted or killed? And I read to you The Second Coming by Yeats. What was coming? Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. More anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and rough beast. The first coming was Christ and the message of love. The second coming was some rough beast. Maybe he was thinking, he was foreseeing Hitler, fascism, Stalin, all the ills of the 20th century were coming. And what followed, the wasteland, that was the feeling, no joy, no, victory. Everyone was dead. Everyone was maimed or dead, including the fatal blow at democracy. It's interesting. Do you know who Ezra Pound is? He was a poet, very American poet, lived much of his life in Italy. But he wrote a poem in 1920, and I think it sums up the devastating feelings that survived the war, and the feeling that Western civilization was finished, that it had survived a grievous blow and would never recuperate from it. There died a myriad. This is Pound. You know, he ended up as a supporter of Mussolini, and he was tried as a traitor, but they found he was insane, so he was confined to an asylum. But he was a great poet. There died a myriad, and of the best among them, for an old bitch gone in the teeth, for a botched civilization, for too gross of broken statues, for a few thousand battered books. That was how he summarized Western civilization, an old bitch gone in the teeth. And that was the feeling that came out of the war. You know, there were parades and crowds and so on, but 1919 in the United States was a terrible year. It was a year when lynchings were common in the South, when people were expelled from the country for the circumstances of their birth, for terrible, I had no idea, because I'm not an American historian, but I had no idea until I started reading about 1919 in the US, about the extent of the chaos, the misery, the wars in the major cities between blacks and whites. It was horrendous. I'll talk about very cheerful topics, right? Come to get chewed up. All right.